Well, hello. I didn't really have time to cover everything in my introduction to the development of environmental psychology, so I thought I'd put that all together now so that at least you have some sort of record of the development that I'd gone to a bit of trouble to try and organize. So, what we're working with is here we are. So the emergence of environmental psychology, obviously, it's a rather personal perspective on this because I was very much involved in the early days of making it all happen. But really, the important thing that you have to remember is that really environmental psychology came out of a desire for change and to do things. It was always driven by something applied, the need for some sort of solution. And the devastation of the First World War gave rise to a deliberate exploration in Britain and in other countries of how the new cities and new places could be created in order to be appropriate for the people. Because they became aware, the decision makers and the architects and government, that really they had no really clear idea of the way people lived, and they needed to examine that. So that was really the early stages of beginning to look at what people did in their various places and to begin to build buildings that would reflect that. Started off with homes, and then there was work on offices, and a variety of other buildings began to be focused on much more in terms of the users. And this was all part of a development of the need across the board to start using science and technology in a much more organized and sophisticated way. And in architecture, they started talking about it being a system with no feedback. That they really, nobody ever very carefully examined what the consequences and impact of particular designs were. It was still regarded something of an art form, and there was a whole movement in the 50s, really given a lot of emphasis by the Festival of Britain, that there was a need for much more of what we today would call an evidence base into the way in which environment is created. And part of that was the development of research activity. I got caught up with the Pilkington Research Unit study of office designs. And my PhD was actually on the impact of office design on worker performance, following through from my supervisor, Brian Wells, who had started studying as part of this exploration of what offices were about and how they were used, to actually start inventing techniques for measuring people's interests and reactions, and looking at their preferences and trying to build that into an understanding of the way in which the physical environment worked. And as I said, my PhD was actually on the psychological implications of office design as part of that whole sort of framework. So it was a new era of beginning to study in this. This is now in the 60s, really, beginning to study how people use their environments, their reactions to them, their feelings about them, and the way in which environments played parts in people's lives. And this is me and the results of my research into office design. And what I discovered was this the idea that design would just influence people, environmental determinism as it became known, was really very naive. That I found actually the results of the research were best explained in terms of looking at where people wanted to work, their actual actions and agency in terms of their working with and using their surroundings. And that what really was part of a great range of of studies evaluating buildings, which has come back and under all sorts of different labels, going into buildings and seeing what people's experiences of them are. And of course, it broadened out into landscapes and into a whole range of other sorts of areas. And it is still a continuing tradition. It is still something that is being used and being part of the whole feedback framework of making buildings and the environment more generally appropriate for people was the starting point of looking at the surroundings as something people interact with and that has significance. And it's a two-way process, people modifying their surroundings and the surroundings shaping opportunities and possibilities for them. And there are a number of people very early on in the 1960s who really began to provide a way of thinking about their surroundings and how people interacted with them. Bob Summer looking at the distances people use between each other and how they use space, which was also the anthropologist Edward T. Hall was looking at this whole idea that people have a set of distances that are relevant to them. So it was really looking at the agency and the way people use their surroundings. Amos Rappaport started off as an architect and really operated as an anthropologist, made this big idea that was really quite novel to architects, that the form of houses was actually a reflection of culture in a whole range of different ways. It wasn't just a functional response to demands. So he was beginning to show that you have to think about the meanings of places and the way they operate. And then a development part of that was Kevin Lynch is looking at the planning and the way people build an image of a city and what it is about the designs and layouts of cities that enables people to formulate some sort of image of it. So you see, there was this behavioral issue of how people use their space and the whole cognitive, socio-cultural issues that were beginning to deal with all of this. And that was that whole process of looking at what people do and experience and the meaning of places and how they build up images of those places really took it very strongly into psychology. They drawing attention how people interact with their surroundings, influenced by their culture and the sense they make of the context, that the whole move away from a simple determinist idea that surroundings influence people, and that's all we need to think about. And that's very important when we come to look at the current concerns with the environment and climate change and how people's interactions have to be understood. It's not simply a matter of shouting at people and telling them they mustn't fly in airplanes or drive their cars or use fossil fuels. That you have to understand how that's part of people's lives and their interactions with their surroundings. And by the mid-1970s, indeed, most schools of architecture had courses in psychology. I put a series of courses together throughout the 5 years at the University of Strathclyde and then converted it into a book, The Psychology for Architects, which reviews everything from developmental psychology through to organizational psychology in a way that's relevant to understanding the design process. And out of that, we began to build a whole range of ideas and research that originally we called architectural psychology. And in 1969, when I would be in my mid-20s, I had the temerity and the chutzpah, somebody would even say, of putting a conference together at the sort of Dallan Dewey was a place that the University of Strathclyde owned for staff to go and have a sort of pleasant weekend, a sort of away day place. And we had the conference there on the on the border of Loch Lomond. It was quite interesting bringing together people, a range of people who were all doing research in this area, but typically you'd only have one person in any particular university, or in some cases in research institutes. And that coming together gave us all some sort of identity and some awareness that this was beginning to be an important and interesting area. And you can see from that book the ways in which there was already a beginning exploration of what sort of explanations can we develop, what sort of theories can we offer up about the interactions with people in their surroundings. And then a variety of studies that really started off at the very, if you like, a very small scale: thermal comfort, the visibility and privacy, and issues like room friendliness. All of those were really coming out of a sort of experimental psychology tradition and trying to see what the relationship was between the physical stimuli and people's reactions to them. And very quickly, we became aware that it was a much more involved cognitive process. And as part of that was the whole move towards saying, well, look, should we be just observing what people do and dealing with them as objects? Or should we be looking at their subjective experience and their understanding and interactions with their physical surroundings? And on the back of that, in 1973, I set up the MSc in Environmental Psychology at the University of Surrey. Terence Lee had done his PhD on neighborhood and people's conceptualization of neighborhood, built around ideas of schemata that he'd studied under Frederick Bartlett. And he wanted to develop environmental psychology within the new department of psychology at Surrey that he was the first professor of. And I came from the School of Architecture at Strathclyde, where I'd worked, as I said, with the Building Performance Research Unit, and earlier on at Liverpool with the Pilkington Research Unit. And I'd learned from that the power of master's courses, because they'd started that at Strathclyde, and I could see how it generated a whole range of ways of studying the particular topics. And because the turnover, a one-year master's course, really produces thesis and dissertations very quickly, a lot of people go on from that to PhDs, and it becomes a motor for driving the discipline and for driving environmental psychology. The central message was, first of all, to incorporate the physical environment into psychology, because reading any psychology textbook, you'd feel social psychology, even cognitive experimental psychology, you'd think that there was no, people operated in a totally non-physical context. So bringing the physical environment into many aspects of psychology was very important. This meant also adopting a more field research orientation that would operate outside the laboratory, because the laboratory was a very particular type of environment, and you could only really study what people did in a laboratory. If you wanted to understand how people made sense of and interacted with the broader environment, you had to go out and do that. And thirdly, it was very clear from the beginning that there would be architects and planners and designers and even lawyers and a whole variety of other people who were interested in people's interactions with their surroundings. So it became very interdisciplinary from the beginning. And indeed, the people who came in, like Peter Stringer, who was a classics expert, who began to look, for instance, at design participation and how people can be involved in the design process. And Ian Griffiths, who came out of a very strongly experimental psychology tradition and working in the Building Research Station and the other government departments looking at working really with engineers, looking at things like thermal comfort and the impact of noise on people. They brought a whole variety of different perspectives to bear, and that made the whole activity very much move across and between different disciplines. And we had to establish our presence in Surrey, and a strong way to do that was by having a conference. So one of the first major environmental psychology conferences we held in Surrey in 1973. And you can see that, again, there are, in those days, studies of the thermal environment and temperature and beginning to look at people's ways of behaving and using their environment, and then a whole move towards a much richer set of methodological contributions of ways of measuring and studying people's interactions with their surroundings. And then I'm beginning to move on from the architectural level through to looking at much more urban issues, neighborhood planning and children's behavior in crowded conditions at a sort of planning level. So it was all beginning to open up already the year that we had actually started the MSc course. And subjective meaning, beginning to look at outdoor spaces, and the whole business of beginning to get to grips with the cross-cultural issues about different ways in which people deal with their surroundings, as well as new sort of methodologies that were all beginning to unfold in this emerging new field in the 1970s. And there weren't any textbooks at the time, and we had to create one built around the material that was the course. And this, again, thermal, acoustic, lighting, space, and then buildings in use, and then understanding the city and living in the city and the natural environment. All of that began to open out and broaden what the field was really dealing with. And I felt there was a need for a central sort of conceptualization of what we were exploring. And I came up with the idea of place as a conceptual system, and that is built around physical attributes, of course, of the physical surrounding, but also people's conceptions, which in their turn related what went on in those locations. And much to my surprise, this book is still very widely cited, and so much so that 40 years on, the publishers have asked me to write a new edition, and building on this idea that places are not just locations, they're not just spaces, but neither are they just concepts or just patterns of activity. All of these things come together and helps us to understand how people deal with their surroundings in relation to these. And the natural environment will have those issues in just the same way. And as I say, this is now expanded. This is the bookshelf above where I'm sitting at the moment. And all of those books are books to do with place. And it's just remarkable how that has just exploded. The whole idea of the design is about placemaking, not just putting shapes and spaces together. And in fact, there's a series on the radio at the moment. This is called something like The Soul of Place, or giving places a soul, which is really a development of this idea that is very powerfully embedded now in many disciplines. In fact, the geographers think they own this area, but of course, at the heart of it are ideas about how people relate to surroundings and how they make sense of them, which is, of course, psychology. And in fact, I just recently put together a set of 18 papers that cover the development of that whole idea of the psychology of place, all the different concepts that have come involved in it, including the powerful idea of the role a person has in a place relates to that place in a particular way, what I've called an environmental role. And that role actually has rules associated of what you're allowed to do where. And again, this is a powerful set of ideas for understanding people's interactions with the larger scale environment and how they relate to issues like climate change. So we had to get moving and make this into a proper, distinct area of research and practice. And so in 1981, I established the Journal of Environmental Psychology. Unfortunately, I can't find a copy of the early ones because I deliberately did it sort of brown, wanting it to look as if it had been published for the last 100 years. But the publishers eventually quite sensibly decided that really it needed to be much livelier. But getting it established in the early days was quite a challenge, convincing publishers that it was worthwhile doing, and then pulling in papers. And really for about 20 years, I kept it going. And then Canadians are now the Americans and taken over, and there's a team, I think, of 5 editors now dealing with it. But it's quite interesting to look at the volume 1 looked at patterns of behavior, different perceptions of National Socialist and classic architecture. And then we did a lot of book reviews, which were beginning to reveal a much more exploration of the cognitive and emotional and meaning aspects of places. If you look at I helped establish the International Association for People Environmental Psychology Studies, IAP. We deliberately decided we didn't want psychology, we didn't want architecture. We wanted to keep it as neutral as possible, and began to have a whole series of conferences around the world, mainly in Britain and in Scandinavia, but increasingly moving further abroad. And that association now has membership all over the world. And so it's interesting how established that really 40 years ago. It's or more, 50 years ago now, how slowly it's become an important resource for people and is attracting huge grants. And the journal, you can see, is changing considerably. This is one of the most recent issues, looking much more at natural resources. It was like I was nature, a letter for future generations, the effectiveness and of intervention and so on. So what I've called green environmental psychology has become the dominant aspects, but it's still looking at favorite places. There is still a wayfinding and a variety of aspects of the study of people's transactions with their surroundings that wouldn't have been out of place in the beginning, although the whole development has moved quite rightly and understandably much more towards understanding how people deal with their physical surroundings and their attitudes towards various aspects of the climate change and ways of dealing with it. The other great activity has been the embracing of the idea that you have to involve people in the decision-making processes about their surroundings. And this is not a simple matter of just getting people to pretend that they're architects. It requires a huge variety of different sorts of interventions. And Daniel Silvano and Susan Goldsman, who met on the MSc course really in its early days, and went to set up together not just a personal partnership, but a professional partnership that now has employs people in 14 cities, over 100 people. It's a hugely successful activity. I mean, talking to Dan about it, it's clear that the origins in California were particularly appropriate. That really California was very open to this whole idea of many people being involved, of inclusivity into the whole design process. But once the success of it was established in California, it moved much further, and it's enormously heartwarming, really, that the ideas we discussed in the early days on the environmental psychology MSc have actually become active processes that are spreading and becoming much more significant across a range of many different contexts. And that involvement of people and that whole activity of exploring how people relate to their surroundings is becoming increasingly a part, of course, of what I've called green environmental psychology, of how you get people to relate to surroundings in ways that are less damaging to the climate. And that has brought on a range of research and practice that is really taking off now. This book of 100 concepts in environmental psychology, as well as a textbook that's already in its second edition. And fascinatingly, I don't think I recognize a single name of the people who've contributed to that textbook. It's a whole other area and range of explorations that are very much based in Germany and in Western Europe, much less so in Britain than was in the early days. And of course, Lily Bernheimer really summarizes the MSc course she did in environmental psychology at Surrey. And Dean Donald worked with me and studied with me and was based at Surrey. And he's recently published this book. So that shows a thriving development of the whole discipline. And in the last few moments, I'm just going to talk very quickly about the broadening influences of environmental psychology. And the one that I got caught up in became known as geographical offender profiling. And this is the idea that if you have crimes committed in a particular area, and over time those grow out, it suggests a psychological development of understanding the opportunities for crime, which suggests that the individual in the early days was still only a beginner in developing those concepts, and that therefore where they lived was likely to be close to those locations. With the extreme crimes happening much further out, it suggests that the early crimes, when the individuals are beginning to develop their careers as criminals, are likely to be the place where they have a base. And that was used by the police and turned out to be very helpful in assisting them to distill down from the many, well, really about 200 possible suspects, to distill it down to a handful and then to focus on one individual who had a base in that area, particularly in the early stages of their criminal activity. And that opened that whole new area of geographical offender profiling. I actually wrote a book about it, and it was a television series. As well as opening up a whole idea of the way in which psychology can contribute to police investigations. And in fact, many of the aspects of the psychological contribution to police investigations could be seen as having its roots in ways of thinking within environmental psychology. And really, the investigative psychology really deals with the idea that the time, places, that all of the meanings and physical qualities a crime uh, give rise to or can be drawn on to try and infer characteristics about the individuals. What I call the profiling equation, and that has become a whole new area of activity. And in fact, because of my experience in setting up environmental psychology, I realized that there was a new area of investigative psychology that brought many of these ideas together. And that has now become master's courses and textbooks and what have you around the world. Has become a discipline that is widely recognized. So you could say that without any doubt, really, that investigative psychology has its roots in really the experience of the development of environmental psychology. The other area is really thinking about all the theories for environmental psychology, particularly place rules and environmental roles, to understand how emergencies become disasters. And this is really because places and their meanings is defined as much by human action as by location and form. And it's out of that that emergencies become disasters because of the power of rules of place and the environmental roles. And this became very, very clear when I looked at the fire in King's Cross Station, where 31 people died. And because of I was asked to look at the behavior in emergencies, I managed to get hold of information about where the fire had occurred, where the bodies had been found, and indeed where people were intending to go. And what we found was that the fire occurred on one of the escalators. Unwittingly, people were shown up the other escalators into the ticket hall where the fire smoke exploded out. And what we found was that the bodies were all found in locations that related to the routes that people would normally take, their environmental roles. And in fact, one individual was in a kiosk, and that's where he stayed all day, and he stayed there. And that the rules of place for him actually meant that he was overcome by smoke and killed. So this was a very powerful illustration of the impact of the way in which people continue with their behavior until it's impossible to do anything else. It's what I call the first law of behavior, is that continuity, that behavior continues on its path unless something dramatic changes it. And that has big implications for understanding the way in which the people's dealing with the physical surroundings and dealing with climate change has so much inertia into it. And one aspect of the work I did with Dave Uzzell and Miriam Como, who were involved obviously at Surrey, there was a disaster at a football ground, and we looked into that behavior for the Popplewell inquiry, and explained it was because of the rules of place that were happening in football grounds. People were who wanted a pleasant entertainment were being driven out by people who wanted a much more macho, much more laddish sort of environment. And interestingly, the publisher chose this photograph for the cover of the book that was published just a few weeks before the disaster that occurred at Hillsborough, in which people were crushed by the whole pattern of activity in those locations. And in fact, one of the recommendations to the Popplewell inquiry was to get rid of the people standing in football grounds, not because of any particular danger to that, but because of the implications it had for how people would behave in those places, and all the patterns of things that were happening there that drove out families and women from football grounds, to change the culture of the football ground by giving some sort of meaning and message as to the nature of the places. And this becomes important when we consider the growth of emergencies. Essentially, people think that the emergency develops in a fairly steady way, but actually it develops exponentially. So in the early stages, they may think that when they look at the change, they think the change is still manageable, but pretty soon it's out of control. And we find this in endless emergencies. People in a house with a cigarette burning in a settee, they look at it, think they ought to do something about it. They're going to get some water, they come back, it's grown a bit. They think they're going about it and tell their friends, and they come back and now it's out of control. It happened in Rwanda with the development of the ethnic murders that grew up. It's happened in many disasters where the growth and rate of change is much more rapid than people realize. And what holds people to their existing situation are the rules of place and their environmental roles. That's what makes them continue to operate in the usual way until they know the rules have changed. It's now a different situation from the one that they are normally part of, and therefore different rules are necessary. I gave some advice to the Mersey Tunnel, who wanted to know how they should design things for an emergency. And I said, the main thing you've got to do is to actually make it very clear it's no longer an ordinary tunnel, and that the escape routes have to then become something absolutely dominant and significant that tells people there are different rules now for operating. And that's what they do. They've got these huge doors that all light up so people can get into the escape route. But on a day-to-day basis, you wouldn't even know they were there. So that I think this is a crucial issue that is not really being taken on board yet when looking at how people deal with climate change and environmental degradation. It needs a radical change of what we expect of each other. The rules that we assume are relevant for particular locations, and the roles that we place in those different locations. So thank you for listening to that. As I say, I've tried to condense a huge range of really, in some ways, it's half a century of work into a short period of time. And, I've always been aware that I'm a gifted, well, thank you for that. This is one of my sculptures, by the way, recycling bits and pieces left around. And living in North Wales, I thought I'd thank you by saying Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.